Hello and welcome. Pull your chair a little closer to the fire, because tonight's tale is one for a night just like this. Cold, quiet, and not entirely safe. Picture a remote country inn, buried under the worst snowstorm Yorkshire has seen in years. A wealthy, unpleasant businessman is found dead in his room. The door locked from the inside, the window painted shut, and not a single footprint marring the snow beyond it. Among the stranded guests sits a small, unassuming old woman with knitting needles and a memory for human nature sharper than any blade. Miss Marple did not come looking for murder, but murder, as it so often does, has come looking for her. If you love a good old-fashioned mystery, the kind where every guest has something to hide, settle in. Let's begin. Arrival and the storm. The snow had been falling since Tewkesbury, and by the time the hired car began its laborious climb into the higher reaches of the moor, Miss Jane Marple had given up any pretense of admiring the scenery. White had given way to white, and white again, until the hedgerows themselves seemed to have surrendered their shape to the storm. "I do hope," she said to the driver, a taciturn young man named Wilkins, who had not spoken above a dozen words since Leeds, "that we shan't be much longer. My niece will be quite worried if I don't telephone from Helmsley tonight." Wilkins grunted something that might have been agreement, and the car shuddered over a rut hidden beneath the drifting snow. Miss Marple folded her gloved hands in her lap and said nothing further, though she privately suspected that Helmsley, and indeed any telephone within reach of it, was now a good many miles beyond their present capabilities. It was Wilkins himself who first spotted the lights of the Stag's Rest, glowing amber through the swirling white like a half-remembered promise, and it was with considerable relief that he turned the car into the inn's narrow yard and declared, with the air of a man washing his hands of the entire business, that he could go no further that night, storm or no storm, money or no money. The Stag's Rest was a low, rambling building of grey stone, its roofline softened under a foot of snow, its windows yellow with lamplight. A wooden sign creaked on rusted hinges above the door, the painted stag upon it nearly worn away by 100 winters. Miss Marple, extracting herself from the car with the careful dignity of a woman well past 70, thought it looked exactly like the sort of inn one read about in novels, and reflected, not for the first time, that novels were not always to be trusted on the subject of comfort. Inside, however, there was a fire, and that went a long way toward forgiveness. The innkeeper, Albert Higgins, was a broad, red-faced man with the look of someone perpetually expecting bad news and rarely disappointed in the expectation. His wife, Mrs. Higgins, moved about the low-beamed taproom with considerably more energy, directing a thin, freckled stable boy named Tom to see to the horses. Though as far as Miss Marple could tell, there was only the one motor car requiring attention, the roads having long since closed to anything else. "You'll not be the last tonight, I shouldn't wonder," Mr. Higgins said, setting a glass of mulled wine before her with a heaviness that suggested the words cost him some effort. "Roads shut from both ends now. Constable rang through not an hour past to say so, before the lines went down entirely." "How very inconvenient," said Miss Marple mildly, though something in her settled, quite without her permission, into the particular alertness of a woman who has found herself, not for the first time, in a small enclosed place, with a collection of strangers and a storm at the door. The strangers arrived in twos and threes over the following hour, shaking snow from their coats with the universal grumbling of travellers thwarted by weather. There was Captain Hugh Bellamy first, a tall, weathered man of perhaps 50, with the upright bearing of long military habit and a clipped moustache going grey at the edges. He took a chair by the fire with the proprietary air of a man accustomed to the best seat in any room, and ordered whiskey in a voice that expected to be obeyed. Close behind him came a young woman travelling alone, introduced by Mrs. Higgins as Miss Lucy Tanner, secretary, though to whom she did not at first say. She was perhaps 26, neatly dressed in a grey travelling suit, with quick dark eyes that moved about the room, cataloguing exits, Miss Marple thought, rather as a nervous bird catalogues hawks. Then there was Dr. Simon Wraxall, a local physician returning from some errand of mercy further along the dale, caught by the storm like everyone else, who settled himself with his bag at his feet and his spectacles fogging gently in the warmth, and fell at once into easy, professional conversation with anyone who would have it. The Carmichaels arrived last, and arrived, Miss Marple noted with interest, separately, though they came through the same door within moments of one another, like two people who had agreed, with some bitterness, to share a destination without sharing a journey. Mr. Reginald Carmichael was a large man, heavy through the shoulders, with the florid complexion of good living and the restless, assessing eyes of a man who had spent his life totting up the worth of every room he entered. His voice, when he demanded the best bedroom in the house, carried an unpleasant note of habitual command. The voice, Miss Marple thought, of a man who had long ago stopped expecting to be refused and had grown careless in consequence. His wife Eleanor was a slight, pale woman, expensively dressed in furs that did not quite manage to disguise a certain thinness about the wrists. She said almost nothing, and what little she did say, she addressed to the fire rather than to any person in the room. "Beastly weather to be caught in," Carmichael announced to the room at large, peeling off wet gloves with evident annoyance. "Bellamy! Didn't expect to see you here of all places." The captain's expression did not so much change as set, like plaster. "Nor are you, Carmichael. Thought you'd be in town for the board meeting." "Postponed," said Carmichael shortly, and something passed between the two men, brief, hard, and entirely unreadable to anyone who had not spent 60 years learning to read precisely such things. Miss Marple, who had spent rather longer than 60 years at it, sipped her mulled wine and said nothing at all, though she filed the exchange away with the same careful attention she might once have given a peculiar wilting in her delphiniums. It struck her, watching the firelit room fill slowly with strangers thrown together by accident of weather, how very like a village it all was, a village compressed by necessity into 4 walls and a single night, with all a village's currents of old grudge and older secret running silently beneath its pleasant surface. She had seen it before, in St. Mary Mead and a dozen places besides. Put any handful of people in a room together for long enough, and sooner or later the masks began, ever so slightly, to slip. Mrs. Higgins came round with more wine, and the talk turned, as talk does on such occasions, to the safer subjects of the weather, the state of the roads, and whether the storm might lift by morning. Captain Bellamy held forth at some length on a similar storm he had weathered in the Khyber Pass, which Dr. Wraxall received with polite skepticism. Miss Tanner said little, though Miss Marple observed that her eyes returned, again and again, to Mr. Carmichael, with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite something else, though it shared elements of both. Mr. Carmichael himself drank a great deal of whiskey, grew louder by degrees, and at one point laughed, a short, ugly bark of a laugh, at some private joke that made his wife's pale face go paler still, and made Captain Bellamy's hand close, just for a moment, rather tightly around his glass. Outside, the wind rose and fell against the old stone walls, and the snow continued, patient and indifferent, to bury the world. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Mr. Carmichael, somewhat unsteadily, announced his intention to retire, demanded that his door be properly bolted against the cold, and made his way up the narrow staircase with the heavy, deliberate tread of a man who has had rather more whiskey than was good for him. Miss Marple watched him go, and then watched, with rather more interest, the small constellation of faces that turned, each in their own fashion, to watch him go also. She took up her knitting and said nothing at all. By morning, of course, it would not matter what anyone had said. The body is found. Miss Marple woke, as she generally did, a little before 7, to find the world outside her small window transformed into something almost unbearably beautiful. The storm had not abated so much as redoubled, and the snow now lay in soft, towering drifts against the inn's grey walls, unbroken by so much as a sparrow's track. It was that very unbrokenness, she would later reflect, that ought to have told her something was dreadfully wrong, hours before anyone screamed. The scream, when it came, was Mrs. Higgins's, and it came shortly after 8, as Miss Marple was descending for breakfast in a grey wool cardigan and her second-best brooch. It was not a long scream, nor an especially loud one, more a kind of strangled, disbelieving gasp that rose and broke off at once, as though the woman who made it could not quite bring herself to finish it. But it brought every soul in the inn out onto the landing within moments. In various states of undress and alarm, Mrs. Higgins stood in the corridor outside Mr. Carmichael's room, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other still holding the breakfast tray she had carried up, now tilted dangerously, a single boiled egg rolling slowly toward the edge. "He's not answering," she managed, when her husband reached her. "I knocked and knocked, Albert, and the door's bolted from the inside, same as he asked, and he's not answering, and there's a smell." It was Captain Bellamy who took charge, as men of his stamp generally did, striding forward with the brisk competence of long habit, and putting his shoulder twice, hard, against the heavy oak door, before it gave way with a splintering crack of old wood. What lay within, Miss Marple saw over several shoulders, for she had not pressed forward as the others had, was Mr. Reginald Carmichael, still in his dressing gown, slumped across the small writing desk beneath the window, a stain spreading dark and wide across the back of the silk, and a thin-bladed letter knife. She recognized it at once as belonging to the desk's own set, for she had noticed it the previous evening, idly, the way she noticed most things, protruding between his shoulder blades. Dr. Wraxall pushed past the others without ceremony, and his examination, brief and professional, confirmed what every person on that landing had already understood in the sick, silent moment of seeing him. "He's been dead some hours," the doctor said quietly, straightening. "Since the night, I should think. Rigors well advanced." He glanced toward the window, painted shut with the thick, immovable paint of decades, and then toward the door, still hanging from one twisted hinge. "Bolted from inside, you say?" "I bolted it myself," said Mr. Higgins, white about the lips. "Heard him do it too. Heard the bolt go, plain as anything, after he went up. And the window's not been opened in years, sir. Paint's thick as my thumb on it." It was Captain Bellamy who voiced what everyone, in their separate ways, had already begun to think. "Then how the devil did anyone get in or out?" There was a silence into which the wind, finding some new gap in the old stonework, made a low, mournful sound, as though the house itself had been asked the same question and found no better answer than the rest of them. Miss Marple, standing a little apart with her hands folded before her, allowed her gaze to travel, not to the body, which held no further information for the untrained eye, but to the window, and beyond it, to the white, unbroken expanse of the inn's side garden, visible through the frost-rimed glass. "Might I ask," she said, in the mild, faintly apologetic tone she generally employed when about to say something inconvenient, "whether anyone has looked at the snow?" Several faces turned toward her with the particular blankness reserved for elderly ladies who interrupt a crisis with apparent irrelevance. "The snow, Miss Marple," said Mr. Higgins, "beneath the window and around it. If someone came in or went out that way, through some means we have not yet considered, there would be marks. And if there are none at all," she went on, peering a little more closely through the glass, with the air of someone examining a faintly disappointing scone, "then I rather think we must consider the matter from quite a different direction altogether." It was Tom, the stable boy, dispatched some minutes later at Captain Bellamy's brisk instruction, who waded out through the drifts below the window and called up, his voice carrying thin and clear through the cold air, that there was nothing there, no footprints, no marks of any kind, save the smooth, undisturbed blanket the knight had laid down hours before, broken only by his own boots, just now. "Snow stopped falling proper round about midnight," Tom added, squinting up at the assembled faces in the broken window above him. "I heard it ease off myself, lying awake on account of the wind banging the stable door. Anything walked through here after that, it'd show." Miss Marple absorbed this with a small nod, as though it confirmed something she had already privately suspected, though in truth she had suspected nothing whatever, beyond the general principle that things which appeared impossible generally were not, and merely awaited the application of sufficient patience. Mrs. Carmichael had not, Miss Marple noticed, come to the doorway at all. She remained at the end of the corridor, very still, very pale, one hand resting against the wall as though she required its support, and her expression, when Miss Marple caught a glimpse of it before the woman turned away, was not the expression Miss Marple might have expected upon a wife learning of her husband's violent death. It was not grief, precisely. It was closer, if anything, to a kind of exhausted relief, swiftly and guiltily suppressed, the way one might feel relief at the end of a long illness one is ashamed to have wished concluded. Miss Tanner, by contrast, had gone the colour of old paper, and stood with both arms wrapped about herself as though the corridor had grown suddenly, bitterly cold, though the fire still burned downstairs and the body's chill had not yet reached so far. "We must telephone the police," Dr. Wraxall said, already moving toward the stairs. "Lines are down," Mr. Higgins reminded him heavily. "Have been since last night, and the road's shut both ends, like I told you." A silence followed this, of a different quality than the one before. The silence not of shock, but of dawning, uncomfortable arithmetic, as 7 living people, an inn full of snow, and the body of a man who could not have been murdered by anyone outside that building, arrived, each in their own mind, at the same conclusion, by a slightly different road. "Then," said Captain Bellamy slowly, "whoever did this is still under this roof." Miss Marple, who had reached precisely that conclusion several minutes earlier, while everyone else had been occupied with the window, said nothing at all. She merely reached into her travelling bag, withdrew her knitting, and settled herself, with the unhurried calm of a woman with nowhere else to be, into the chair at the top of the stairs, from which vantage point, she reflected, one could see almost the whole of the corridor, and every door that opened off it. It promised, she thought, to be a most interesting morning. Questions begin. It was Captain Bellamy, predictably, who took it upon himself to organize the household, on the not unreasonable grounds that someone must, and that he had commanded men before, and saw no particular obstacle to commanding a snowbound inn full of civilians. "No one leaves the building," he announced to the assembled company in the tap-room, where they had all gathered, by some unspoken agreement, rather than remain scattered about the upper corridor with a dead man for company. "No one disturbs the room. When the road's clear, the police will want everything precisely as it stands. In the meantime, I propose we each account for our movements last night, plainly and honestly, and have done with it." "And who?" asked Mr. Higgins, with the wary look of a man unused to being addressed in his own tap-room, as though it were a parade ground. "Put you in charge, Captain?" "No one," Bellamy admitted, with something almost like a smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "But someone must keep order, and I don't see you stepping forward, Higgins." It was Miss Marple, knitting quietly in the corner by the window, who observed, to no one in particular, and in a tone so mild it took a moment to register as an observation at all, that the captain seemed rather keen to be first, to establish the manner in which questions were to be asked, which was, she thought, an interesting thing for a man to be keen about, when one considered it. No one, in the bustle of the moment, considered it. Miss Marple resumed her knitting and made a small mental note. The accounting of the night, when it came, proved a thin and unsatisfying business, as such accountings generally do. Mrs. Carmichael, when pressed, said in a voice barely above a whisper that she had retired to her own room, separate from her husband's, a fact she offered without apparent embarrassment, as though it was simply the natural order of things, shortly after 10, and had heard nothing until Mrs. Higgins's scream that morning. She had taken, she admitted, a sleeping draught prescribed by her own physician in London, on account of her nerves, and had slept heavily and without interruption. "Convenient," murmured Captain Bellamy, not quite under his breath. "I beg your pardon," said Mrs. Carmichael, with the first flash of spirit she had shown, "but I did not arrange to be widowed for my convenience, Captain, whatever you may imply." Dr. Wraxall, called upon next, confirmed that he had retired to his room around 10:30, had read for perhaps an hour by candlelight, and had heard, at some point he could not precisely fix, perhaps 11, perhaps a little after, a door close somewhere along the corridor, though whose door, or in which direction, he could not say with any confidence. Miss Tanner's account was the shortest of all. She had gone up early, she said, before 10, with a headache, and had heard nothing whatever. Her hands, Miss Marple noted, were folded very tightly in her lap as she said it, the knuckles pale, and her eyes did not once lift from them. "You worked for Mr. Carmichael, I understand," said Captain Bellamy. "As his secretary?" "Yes." "For how long?" 18 months. A pause. "He was a difficult man to work for, Captain, if that's what you're asking. I shan't pretend otherwise. But I did not kill him." "No one has suggested you did, Miss Tanner," said Bellamy, though something in the careful neutrality of his tone suggested he had, in fact, been suggesting precisely that, and had simply not yet committed himself to it aloud. When it came to the captain's own account, he gave it crisply, almost too crisply, as though it had been rehearsed, retired around 11, slept soundly, woke at his usual hour of 6:30, and had been downstairs reading the previous week's newspaper, left by some earlier guest, when Mrs. Higgins's scream interrupted his breakfast. "And did you and Mr. Carmichael know one another well, before last night?" Miss Marple asked, in the gentle, faintly vague tone of an old woman making conversation rather than conducting an inquiry, though every person in the room, had they been paying closer attention, might have noticed that it was the first question she had asked aloud all morning, and that it landed with rather more weight than its delivery suggested. The captain's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We were business associates, some years now, nothing more." "How interesting," said Miss Marple placidly, returning her attention to a dropped stitch. "Because last night, when he mentioned the postponed board meeting, you looked, if you'll forgive my saying so, very much like a man who had hoped never to see his business associate again." A silence followed this that was, in its way, rather more eloquent than anything that had been said all morning. "I don't care for your tone, madam," said Bellamy stiffly. "I have no tone at all, Captain," said Miss Marple, with perfect truthfulness. "I am merely an old woman who notices things. It is a great failing of mine. My niece tells me so constantly." Mr. and Mrs. Higgins, questioned in turn, could offer little beyond confirmation that the inn's doors had all been properly bolted for the night by 11:30, as was their custom in winter, and that Tom had checked the stables and the side door, as he did every evening, before retiring to his own small room above them. Tom himself, summoned in from the cold, where he had been clearing a path to the woodshed, gave his account with the open, slightly anxious manner of a boy unused to being questioned by his betters. He had banked the fires, checked the doors, and gone to bed around 10, woken twice in the night by the wind, and had seen and heard nothing of any person moving about the inn at all. It was, all told, a most unsatisfactory morning's work, and Miss Marple, reviewing it later over a cup of tea that had gone quite cold in the general disturbance, found herself in possession of a great many small, disconnected facts, and no very clear idea of how they might be made to fit together, which was, she reflected, very much how these things generally began, and not at all a cause for discouragement. What struck her most, turning the morning over in her mind as one might turn over a half-finished piece of knitting to check for dropped stitches, was not what had been said, but what had not. No one, not the widow, not the secretary, not the captain with his careful, rehearsed account, had asked the single question that seemed to Miss Marple the most natural one in the world for any person to ask upon learning that a man they knew had been murdered in a locked room. No one had asked who might have wanted Reginald Carmichael dead. It was, she thought, rather as though every person in that room already knew the answer and had simply agreed, without a word passing between them, not to be the first to say so. She picked up her knitting once more and began, very quietly, to count the stitches and the suspects, and to wonder which of the two would prove the more difficult to get right. Secrets in the snow. By early afternoon, the storm had settled into a steady, monotonous fall, and the inn had settled, in its own way, into the peculiar rhythm of a household waiting for something it could not name. Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that people confide more readily in an old woman with knitting than in any official with a notebook, made it her business to be quietly, unobtrusively present wherever conversation seemed likely to occur, by the fire, in the passage outside the kitchen, on the window seat that overlooked the buried garden. It was there, on the window seat, that Mrs. Higgins found her an hour or so after luncheon, and there, with the particular looseness of tongue that follows a great shock, that she unburdened herself of rather more than she perhaps intended. "A wicked man, if you'll pardon my saying it of the dead," Mrs. Higgins said, settling herself with a sigh, and a basket of mending she did not in fact touch. "I oughtn't speak ill, I know, but there's been an atmosphere in this inn since they all arrived that I haven't liked, not one bit. That poor Mrs. Carmichael, thin as a rail, and frightened of her own shadow, near enough. And the secretary, Miss Tanner. I heard them quarrelling, you know, before dinner, through the wall of the small parlour, while I was laying the fire." "Quarrelling," Miss Marple repeated, with the encouraging mildness of a woman who has heard a great many quarrels through a great many walls in her time. "About what, I wonder?" "Money, I should think, from the little I caught. He said something about her not having a leg to stand on, and being grateful for what she'd been given, and she said—" Mrs. Higgins lowered her voice, glancing toward the door. "She said he'd be sorry if he didn't do right by her. Those were her very words, Miss Marple. He'd be sorry." It was, Miss Marple reflected, the sort of remark that might mean almost anything, said, as it so often was, by people with no intention whatever of doing the sorrowful party any actual harm. And yet it was also, undeniably, the sort of remark one noted and set carefully aside, like a seed pressed between the pages of a heavy book, to see what it might grow into later. The captain, when Miss Marple came upon him some while later in the small smoking room, glowering into a glass of whisky rather earlier in the day than was perhaps advisable, proved a harder nut to crack, though not, in the end, impossible. "You knew Mr. Carmichael rather longer than some years, I think, Captain," she said, settling herself opposite him with her knitting, as though continuing a conversation already well underway, rather than beginning one entirely afresh. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face seemed to give way, very slightly, like a wall that has held a great weight for a long time and has simply, quietly, had enough. 20 years, he said heavily. "We served together, after a fashion," he supplied to my regiment, "in the war. Made his first real money off it, if you want the truth, and made it the way men like Carmichael generally do, cutting corners. Men died, Miss Marple, because of equipment that wasn't what it should have been, and Carmichael knew it, and Carmichael paid the right people to look the other way. He drank. I've spent 20 years in business with a man I despised because he had information that could have ruined me twice over, and because the alternative was worse than the arrangement. That answer your question?" "It answers a great deal of it," said Miss Marple gently, "though I confess I am still curious why a man might continue, for 20 years, to do business with someone he despised so thoroughly, when the storm that finally trapped you both together seems to have settled the matter rather more permanently." The captain's eyes came up sharply. "If you're asking whether I killed him, madam, the answer is no. I'll admit I'm not sorry he's dead. I won't pretend otherwise, not to you, not to anyone, but I didn't put a knife in his back." "I never suggested you had," said Miss Marple placidly, though she noted, with the particular attentiveness she brought to such things, that he had said knife and not letter knife, though no one in the general company had yet specified the weapon beyond what little had been seen through the broken door. A small thing, very possibly nothing at all, and yet the sort of small thing she had learned, over a long life of small village observations, not to discard too readily. Mrs. Carmichael proved the most difficult of all to draw out, and it was not until late afternoon, finding the widow alone in the little parlour with the curtains half drawn against the failing light, that Miss Marple made any headway whatever. "You need not pretend to grieve for my benefit, my dear," Miss Marple said, taking the chair opposite without invitation, in the comfortable manner of a woman long past caring whether her presence was strictly wanted. "I have buried 2 husbands of my own acquaintance, though not, I am glad to say, my own, and I have noticed that grief and relief are not always strangers to one another in the same heart. There is no shame in it." Something in Mrs. Carmichael's careful composure cracked, very slightly at that, and for a moment Miss Marple saw, beneath the expensive furs and the pale, controlled face, a much younger and much more frightened woman than the one who had descended for breakfast that morning. "He was going to divorce me," Mrs. Carmichael said, very quietly, to the unlit fire, rather than to her companion. "Not because he wished to be free of me, he cared nothing for that, but because it would have ruined me, you see, socially and financially both, and he knew it, and it amused him. He told me so himself, 3 weeks ago, quite calmly, over breakfast, the way another man might mention the weather." Her hands twisted in her lap. "I am not sorry he is dead, Miss Marple. I will not insult either of us by pretending otherwise. But I did not kill him. I hadn't the courage, if I am honest. I have spent 11 years not having the courage." Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment, only watching the woman with the particular gentle attention she had once turned upon a great many unhappy wives in St. Mary Mead. Women whose unhappiness had taken every shape from quiet endurance to sudden terrible action, and who had taught her, over the years, that the line between the two was very much thinner than anyone cared to admit. By evening, when the household gathered once more before the fire, for there was, after all, nowhere else to go, and the body upstairs would keep its own counsel until the roads cleared, Miss Marple found herself in possession of a great many secrets, large and small, a quarrel about money, an old wartime grievance, a marriage built on threat and endurance, and somewhere beneath all of it, she suspected, one secret larger than the rest, not yet spoken aloud by anyone. She thought, watching the firelight move across the assembled faces, Bellamy's grim and closed, Eleanor Carmichael's pale and still, Lucy Tanner's carefully blank, the Higginses moving about their duties with the over-bright efficiency of people determined not to think too closely about what lay upstairs, that it was rather like a tapestry seen from the wrong side. All the threads were there, crossing and recrossing in a pattern that made no sense at all from this angle, and yet she had not the smallest doubt that, turned the right way round, it would resolve itself into something perfectly clear. She had only to find the right thread to pull. Unfortunately, as she was very shortly to discover, she very nearly pulled the wrong one entirely. A wrong turn. It was, Miss Marple would later admit, with some private chagrin, the matter of the letter knife that led her astray, and led her astray with a confidence she generally reserved for matters considerably more certain than this one proved to be. She had noticed, on the first evening, Captain Bellamy's particular interest in the small writing desk in the residence lounge, an interest that had seemed, at the time, no more than the idle curiosity of a man examining his surroundings, but which returned to her now, turned over in the new light of his confession about the war, his old grievance, his 20 years of buried resentment, with rather more weight than it had originally carried. He had said knife, not letter knife. He had known Carmichael's habits, his vanities, his small daily routines, for 2 long decades, and he had, by his own admission, wished the man dead for a very great deal longer than one snowbound night. It was, she told herself, settling into her chair with the satisfied air of a woman who has at last found the dropped stitch she has been hunting for all afternoon, simply a matter of motive, means, and a long, slow-burning resentment finally given its opportunity. The captain had been the last to retire of the men, by his own account. The captain had military training, precision, a steady hand, the cold practicality required to do violence efficiently and without hesitation. The captain, moreover, had seemed almost eager that very morning to direct the questioning of others, which struck her now, examined, in this new and rather more suspicious light, as exactly the sort of thing a guilty man might do to deflect attention from himself. She found Mrs. Higgins in the kitchen and asked, with what she hoped was suitable delicacy, whether the captain's room shared a wall with Mr. Carmichael's, and was gratified to learn that it did, separated only by the width of the corridor, in fact, and the briefest of distances besides. "And did you happen to notice," Miss Marple asked, "whether the captain's boots, this morning, showed any sign of having been worn in the night? Damp, perhaps, or marked in any unusual way?" Mrs. Higgins, flustered by the question's specificity, admitted that she had not thought to look, but that she could certainly find out, and bustled off with the eager energy of a woman glad of an errand that did not involve dwelling overlong on the body upstairs. It was at this point, with what she privately considered the makings of a very tidy solution indeed, that Miss Marple made her way to the smoking room to put a rather more direct question to the captain himself, and found, instead, Dr. Wraxall, sitting alone with a small leather case open upon his knee, engaged in the unremarkable business of checking and rechecking the contents of his medical bag. "Dr. Wraxall," she said, settling herself opposite him with the comfortable ease of long practice, "I wonder if I might ask you something about the wound." The doctor looked up, his spectacles catching the firelight. "I examined him only briefly, Miss Marple. I'm no police surgeon, but ask away, by all means." "The angle of the blow," she said. "Forgive me, I know it is a distasteful subject, but was it the sort of blow a man might strike from a position of some height advantage? A tall man, standing, against a shorter man seated at the desk?" Dr. Wraxall considered this with the careful, methodical air of a man unwilling to commit himself beyond his certain knowledge. "It's possible," he said slowly. "The angle was downward, certainly. Driven in and slightly down, as I recall it, which would suggest the killer stood while Carmichael sat, or else stooped over him from behind. But I'd hesitate to say more than that without a proper examination. It's not a science one ought to guess at, Miss Marple, however tempting the guessing." It was a small enough qualification, and Miss Marple, fixed as she was upon the satisfying shape her solution had begun to take, did not, in that moment, give it quite the weight it deserved. A tall man. Bellamy was tall, taller than anyone else in the inn, by a good 4 inches. It fit. It fit so neatly, in fact, that she found herself almost looking forward to the small, quiet triumph of laying it before Captain Bellamy himself and watching his composure crack as Mrs. Carmichael's had cracked, as Lucy Tanner's reserve had nearly cracked, under the simple pressure of being seen clearly at last. She found him in the tap-room, nursing what was certainly not his first whiskey of the evening, and seated herself across from him with rather more directness than she had employed with anyone else that day. "Captain Bellamy," she said, "I think it is time you told me the truth about where you were between 11:30 and midnight last night." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face, not guilt, she would realize only later, but a kind of exhausted, wounded surprise, settled into stillness. "I was in my room, madam, as I told you this morning. You said knife, this afternoon, rather than letter knife. A small thing, perhaps, but you have known Mr. Carmichael's habits for 20 years, his desk, his possessions. Because every man in England calls a knife, Miss Marple, whatever its particular pedigree, and I'll thank you not to build a gallows out of my choice of words." His voice had gone hard now, hard and tired both. "I told you the truth this morning. I told you the truth an hour ago. I despised the man, God forgive me, but I have spent 20 years not killing him, through 2 wars and a great deal worse provocation than last night offered, and I see no reason why last night, of all nights, should have been the one that broke me." "It was," Miss Marple reflected afterward, turning the whole exchange over with the particular discomfort of a woman obliged to examine her own error. Not so much what he said as the manner of it that gave her pause. Not the practiced evasion of a guilty man caught out, but the raw, almost offended honesty of an innocent one wrongly accused, which was, she had learned over a very long life, an entirely different texture of response, and one she ought to have recognized at once, had she not been so pleased with the neatness of her own theory. It was Tom, of all people, who delivered the small, decisive blow to her construction, finding her not an hour later by the fire, and mentioning, with the artless candor of a boy who has no idea he is correcting his elders, that he'd seen the captain's window from the yard that morning while clearing snow, and that there'd been no boot marks beneath it either, same as everywhere else. Though, I don't suppose that signifies much, miss, seeing as nobody's window had marks under it, on account of nobody going out a window in that storm. More fool anyone who tried. It was a small remark, offered in passing, and yet it struck Miss Marple with the force of a much larger one, because it reminded her, gently, and rather humblingly, that she had allowed herself to become so absorbed in the question of who, that she had quite neglected to keep asking, with the patience the matter truly required, the much harder and much more important question of how. She sat very still for a long moment, her knitting forgotten in her lap, and felt the particular, familiar discomfort of an old woman obliged to admit, if only to herself, that she had very nearly done a serious injustice to an innocent man out of nothing more than a tidy theory and her own eagerness to have one. "I have been a great fool," she said quietly, to no one in particular, and Tom, busy stacking logs by the hearth, took this for the ordinary muttering of the elderly and paid it no further mind. But Miss Marple, watching the fire settle into embers, understood it for exactly what it was. Not the end of her inquiry, but the necessary, uncomfortable beginning of doing it properly. The pattern emerges. Miss Marple slept badly that night, which was not, in her experience, always a misfortune. It was in the particular restlessness of 3 o'clock in the morning, that unhelpful hour which strips away the comfortable certainties of daylight and leaves one in possession of nothing but the bare, uncomfortable bones of things, that she found herself lying quite still in the narrow inn bed, staring at the ceiling, and thinking not about what she knew, but about what she had assumed, and how very differently those two categories presented themselves when one took the trouble to separate them properly. She had assumed the locked room meant an outsider locked out. She had assumed the absence of footprints in the snow meant the killer had come and gone by the window. She had assumed, in short, all of the things a person of reasonable intelligence might assume upon first encountering a locked door and an undisturbed fall of snow, without pausing to ask the rather more fundamental question of whether those assumptions had any genuine foundation whatever, or whether they had simply presented themselves with the convincing air of facts, the way assumptions generally do when one is in a hurry to reach a conclusion. She rose at 5:30, dressed quietly, and came downstairs to make herself a cup of tea in Mrs. Higgins's kitchen, which that good woman, arriving an hour later to begin the breakfast, accepted with the unsurprised equanimity of someone long accustomed to finding unexpected visitors in domestic corners at unusual hours. "Mrs. Higgins," said Miss Marple, warming her hands about her cup, "when you bolted the front door last night, and the side door, are those the only ways into the inn from outside?" "Front, side, and the kitchen scullery door," Mrs. Higgins said, tying on her apron with brisk efficiency. "All three were bolted by Albert before 11, same as always, and the bolt on Mr. Carmichael's door. Would you describe it for me, if you don't mind?" Mrs. Higgins gave her a slightly puzzled look, but complied readily enough. "It was the original bolt," she said, "that had been on that room for 30 years or more. A heavy old iron thing, the kind with a long keep, set into the doorframe deep, that ran with a sound loud enough to be heard in the next room, which was why Mr. Higgins had heard it so distinctly when Carmichael drew it after going up. And the room itself," Miss Marple continued, "is there anything fixed to the wall, hooks perhaps, or a clothes rail, near the door, specifically?" Mrs. Higgins's brow furrowed in the effortful way of a woman summoning a precise mental picture she has never had occasion to look at carefully. "There's a row of coat hooks," she said at last. "Old wooden ones. Albert's father put them up. They run along the wall just beside the door. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," said Miss Marple, in a tone that anyone who knew her would have recognized immediately as signifying a very particular reason indeed. She ate her breakfast quietly and alone, and then, when the household had begun to stir, and the smell of burned toast and uncertainty had returned to the corridors, she went upstairs. The broken door to Carmichael's room still hung from its twisted hinge, which was convenient, as it meant she was able to enter without any of the awkwardness of forcing it. She stood just inside the threshold for a long moment, not moving, not touching anything, simply looking, the way she had been taught, not by any policeman or detective, but by 40 years of examining complicated things, from overgrown gardens to difficult people, with the steady, unhurried eye of someone in no particular rush to see what she expected to see, instead of what was actually there. The room was not large. A single bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk beneath the sealed window, a washstand. Carmichael's dressing gown still lay in its dreadful sprawl across the desk, the stain now fully dried and darkened. She did not look at it more than was necessary. She looked, instead, at the coat hooks beside the door. There were 4 of them, solid old wooden pegs, set into a horizontal rail screwed to the wall about 6 feet up. Carmichael's overcoat hung on the first, his scarf on the second, his hat on the third. The fourth was empty. Nothing remarkable in that. And yet, she crossed to the door and examined the bolt. Heavy iron, precisely as Mrs. Higgins had described, running in a keep set deep into the wooden frame. She slid it. It moved smoothly enough, well oiled despite its age, and examined the way it sat in its keep, the small bright scratches on the metal where it had been drawn back and forth over many years. And then she looked at the gap between the bottom of the door and the floorboards. It was not a large gap, an inch, perhaps a little more, the settling of old timbers, the slight warping of a door hung in a stone frame through many changes of temperature, of damp and dry. But it was there. She straightened slowly and stood for a moment with her hands folded before her, looking at the bolt and the gap beneath the door and the coat hooks on the wall, and letting the pattern that had been assembling itself in the back of her mind for the past 24 hours come, very quietly, and without any fanfare at all, to the front of it. Oh, she thought. Oh, how very simple. It was, like all truly elegant things, a matter of the ordinary become unexpected. A rearrangement, not of the facts, but of the order in which one looked at them. She had been imagining a complicated mechanism, hidden passages, external entry, some ingenious and elaborate device designed to defeat the lock from without. But there was no elaborate device. There had never been any need for one. What there was a piece of string, or something very like it. She went back downstairs with the careful, deliberate composure of a woman suppressing a fairly considerable agitation, and found Tom in the yard, wrestling a frozen pump into cooperation, and asked him, in a voice she kept admirably steady, what he had done with the coal scuttle from outside Mr. Carmichael's room. Tom stared at her. The coal scuttle, miss? It was in the corridor last evening, between Mr. Carmichael's room and the captain's. I noticed it as I passed, just before dinner. It is not there this morning. I wondered where it had gone. Tom's brow creased with honest effort. I moved it, he said after a moment. Early on, before Mrs. Higgins found him, like, before all the fuss. I moved it back down to the cellar because it was empty and I was going to fill it. Thought nothing of it, miss. Should I have left it? No, said Miss Marple gently. No, I don't suppose you could have known. It is quite all right, Tom. She returned to the taproom and sat for a long while by the dead fire, her hands still in her lap, the knitting, for once, quite forgotten, and assembled the whole of it slowly and methodically, the way one assembles a puzzle, not by forcing the pieces, but by turning them until the fit presents itself without argument. The coal scuttle placed outside the door, the gap beneath that door, an inch, perhaps rather more. The piece of cord, or string, or whatever it had been, for something of the kind must have been employed, she was quite certain of it now, threaded beneath that gap, looped about the bolt, drawn through and downward, and the bolt thus slid home by a hand already outside the room. The string pulled clear, or perhaps left, trimmed close, the end of it invisible in the thick darkness of the corridor floor. The coal scuttle pressed against the base of the door to prevent any draught or noise carrying the sound of the mechanism. A simple thing, a dreadfully simple thing, requiring only patience and steadiness and a complete knowledge of that room's particular quirks of door and bolt and gap. A complete knowledge, that was the thing. Not a passer-through, not a casual guest. Someone who knew that room, and knew it well, and had known it long enough to have observed the gap beneath the door, the looseness of the bolt in its keep, the depth of the corridor's nighttime silence. She thought of what Mrs. Higgins had told her about the inn's regulars. She thought of something Miss Tanner had said, something small and almost parenthetical, which she had filed away 2 days ago without quite understanding why it mattered. And she thought of Carmichael's face, on the evening of their arrival, the particular expression, Not of a man encountering a business acquaintance unexpectedly, but of a man encountering something else entirely, someone he had not expected, and had not, she rather thought, been glad to see. The fire was laid but unlit. She looked at it without seeing it, and felt the pattern complete itself beneath her hands, like a row of stitches finally, irrevocably, joined. She knew who had killed Reginald Carmichael. She knew how they had done it. She knew why. What remained, and this was, in its own way, the most delicate part of the whole business, was to be absolutely, unassailably certain before she said a single word to anyone, because an old woman had already made one serious error in this matter, and she had no intention whatever of making a second. The confrontation. She waited until after luncheon. It was not, as Captain Bellamy would later suggest, a theatrical instinct for timing, though Miss Marple did privately believe that the right moment for a difficult conversation was one in which all parties were settled and warm and had eaten something, because hungry, cold people are given to rashness, and rashness in these situations benefited no one, least of all the truth. It was simply that she spent the morning making absolutely certain of the three things she had told herself she must be certain of before she spoke, and certainty, in her experience, did not always arrive on a convenient schedule. The first thing she confirmed with Mrs. Higgins, over the quiet pretext of helping to clear the breakfast things, was a matter of the inn's guest register, specifically whether any of the present company had stayed at the Stag's Rest before. The second was a private examination of the length of dark cord she had found, coiled neatly beneath the narrow dresser in Miss Tanner's room, during the brief window in which Miss Tanner had gone downstairs for tea and left her door, by the small mercy of an old latch that did not catch properly, standing a quarter-inch ajar. The third was a single question she put to Tom, very quietly, in the stable yard, about what he had seen on the evening of their arrival, before dinner, in the upstairs corridor. And Tom, with the devastating helpfulness of a young man who does not yet understand the weight of small observations, told her. At 2:30, Miss Marple asked Mr. Higgins if she might have the use of the tap-room, and Mr. Higgins, bewildered but compliant, assembled the household as she requested. The captain, the doctor, Mrs. Carmichael, Miss Tanner, and the Higginses themselves, including Tom, who stood nearest the door with the slightly anxious expression of someone not entirely sure whether he was a witness or a suspect, and hoping very much to be neither. Miss Marple stood by the fireplace, not for dramatic effect, she told herself, but because the fire was behind her, and the light from the window was in front of her, which meant she could see every face in the room clearly, and every face in the room could see her. She began, as she generally did, with an apology. "I am afraid I have been very slow," she said with perfect sincerity. "Slower than I ought to have been, and I went badly wrong in the middle of it, which I'm not proud of, and which I shall ask Captain Bellamy to forgive, since it was he who bore the weight of my error most directly." She glanced at the captain, who gave a single stiff nod that was, she thought, rather generous under the circumstances. "But I believe I know now what happened to Mr. Carmichael, and how, and why, and I think it best that it be said plainly, before any more time passes." The room was very quiet. Outside, the snow fell on. "The locked room," she began, "is the thing everyone fixed upon first. Naturally enough, myself included, I am sorry to say. A door bolted from the inside, a window painted shut, no footprints in the snow. It has the appearance of an impossibility, and impossibilities are rather magnetic things. One cannot help but stare at them. But the locked room was not, in fact, the puzzle. It was the solution, the answer to a different question entirely, which is, how does one commit a murder and then ensure that the body is not discovered until a good many hours have passed and the night's evidence has had time to settle? She paused and let her gaze move, very briefly and without emphasis, to Miss Tanner, before continuing. The mechanism itself is straightforward enough, once one abandons the assumption that the bolt was drawn from the inside. A length of cord, dark cord, the kind one finds in any packing case, threaded through the gap at the base of the door, looped about the bolt, drawn back in a single smooth pull from the corridor. The coal scuttle was pressed against the base of the door to muffle the sound of the bolt sliding home and to prevent any draft carrying the cord's movement. It is an old method, a very old one. I believe it has appeared in more than one coroner's record over the years, though it is quite surprising how rarely people think of it when confronted with what appears to be a locked room. She looked at her hands. The cord, once the bolt was drawn, was slipped free beneath the door, and the coal scuttle moved back into its usual place in the corridor. Tom moved it to the cellar the following morning, before the body was found, in perfect innocence. Tom made a small, unhappy sound. Miss Marple gave him a brief, reassuring glance. "The method requires two things above all others," she continued. "A precise knowledge of the gap beneath that particular door, which is rather larger than average, owing to the settling of old timber, and a precise knowledge of the bolt's mechanism, which runs smoothly and draws without resistance. Neither of those things can be known from a single night's acquaintance with the room." She paused. "Miss Tanner stayed at the Stag's Rest in the autumn of last year. Mr. Higgins's register confirms it. She stayed for 3 nights in that very room while accompanying Mr. Carmichael on a business matter in the Dale. She knew the room, the bolt, the door, and the gap, because she had slept behind that door herself. The silence that followed was of a different quality than anything that had preceded it that afternoon. Not the taut, collective silence of people listening, but the particular, held silence of a single person deciding, in the space of a moment, what there is left to say. Miss Lucy Tanner sat very still. "There is something else," Miss Marple said, more gently now. "On the evening of our arrival, before dinner, Tom observed Miss Tanner in the upper corridor, trying the handle of Mr. Carmichael's door, which was, at that early hour, not yet locked. He thought nothing of it at the time. A guest, perhaps confused about which room was hers. But Miss Tanner's room is at the other end of the corridor, and she had been shown to it by Mrs. Higgins not half an hour before. She was not confused. She was confirming that the layout of the room had not changed since her last visit, that the desk was still beneath the window, that the gap beneath the door was as she remembered it. She stopped. In the fireplace, a log settled with a soft, collapsing sound. "And the cord," Miss Marple said, very quietly, "is in a coil beneath the dresser, in your room, Miss Tanner, where I imagine you intended to burn it this evening, when the household was occupied elsewhere." Lucy Tanner raised her eyes then, and what Miss Marple saw in them was not the expression she might have expected. Not fury, not desperation, not the wild, cornered energy of discovery. It was something far quieter than that. It was, in its way, the same expression she had seen in Eleanor Carmichael's face the previous afternoon. That exhausted, guilty, unmistakable relief. "He was going to ruin me," Miss Tanner said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "Not just dismiss me. I could have borne that. He was going to write to every firm in London that might have employed me and tell them I had stolen from him. It was a lie, but the kind of lie that sticks, because he was who he was, and I was only who I am. I had no money, no family to speak of, no protection of any kind." She pressed her lips together. "He told me so, the week before, in his office in town." He smiled while he said it. He was very good at smiling. No one spoke. "I had been his secretary for 18 months, she continued, with the measured calm of someone who has rehearsed nothing but means every word. "I had done everything he asked of me. Everything. And when I would not do a certain other thing he required, he decided it would amuse him to destroy me instead." A small pause. "I came to Yorkshire knowing what I meant to do. I knew we would both be here. I had arranged it that way. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." The fire burned. The snow fell against the window in a steady, indifferent whisper. "I am sorry," Miss Tanner said, and she seemed to mean it, though to whom she addressed it was not entirely clear, perhaps to the room in general, perhaps to no one in particular. "I am not sorry he is dead, but I am sorry for all of this." She looked down at her hands, and then across at Mrs. Carmichael, who sat without expression, her pale face giving nothing away, her gloved hands perfectly still in her lap. "Mrs. Carmichael," Miss Tanner said, I am sorry most of all to you. Whatever he was your husband, and you have had to sit in this room and hear all of this." Eleanor Carmichael looked at her for a long, unreadable moment, and then looked away into the fire. "Don't be," she said, very quietly, and said nothing else at all. Captain Bellamy was the first to find his voice, and he used it with commendable restraint. "When the road's clear, there will have to be a proper accounting," he said, looking at Miss Tanner. "You understand that?" "Yes," said Miss Tanner simply. "I have understood that from the beginning." Miss Marple said nothing. She sat with her hands folded, the knitting, the first time in 3 days, entirely absent from them, and watched the fire burn down, and felt the particular, complicated weight of a truth fully uncovered. Not the light, clean satisfaction she might once have imagined it would be, but something heavier and more human than that, as most true things, in the end, turned out to be. Resolution and departure. The snow stopped sometime before dawn. Miss Marple knew it before she looked out of her window, in the way one knows such things after a long night of listening. Not by any sound the snow made in stopping, but by the sudden, profound quality of the silence it left behind. A silence quite different from the muffled, ongoing hush of a storm, clean and absolute, and somehow final, the way the closing of a heavy door is different from the sound of wind. She lay still for a while in the narrow bed, watching the ceiling lighten by degrees from grey to pale grey to the particular thin, washed white of a December morning after snowfall, and allowed herself, for perhaps the first time since she had descended the stairs and found Mrs. Higgins with her tilting breakfast tray, simply to be an old woman who was tired. She was tired. There was no point pretending otherwise. Not physically tired, particularly, though that was there too, the particular ache of cold rooms and poor sleep, but tired in the way that came after these things, the way that no one ever quite prepared one for, not the novels one read as a girl, not even the real experiences one accumulated over a long life of stumbling into the worst of what people did to one another. The solving was never the clean, bright thing the stories suggested. The solving was always followed by this, the weight of it, the particulars of it, the human faces of it that one could not afterwards forget. She thought of Lucy Tanner's steady voice. He smiled while he said it. He was very good at smiling. She thought of Eleanor Carmichael's face, turned toward the fire, and the 2 small words with which she had ended the conversation, and the whole of a marriage contained in them. She rose, dressed, and went downstairs. The constable arrived shortly after 9 in the morning, riding up the lane on a horse that seemed deeply unimpressed by the whole enterprise, followed at a considerable distance by a second man on foot, who turned out to be a sergeant from Helmsley, red-faced and breathing hard, who had walked the last mile through drifts above his knee because the police car had become irrevocably embedded in a drift on the lower road and showed no inclination to become unembedded. They were both young and both slightly overwhelmed, and they managed the business with a competence that was, given the circumstances, rather admirable. Though neither of them, Miss Marple privately observed, asked quite the right questions at quite the right times, and one of them wrote everything in a notebook with the laborious thoroughness of a man transcribing rather than thinking. Miss Marple gave her account quietly and completely, omitting nothing and adding nothing, and was thanked with the polite, faintly distracted gratitude of young men with a great deal still to do, and an elderly witness they were not entirely sure what to make of. Lucy Tanner was taken into custody with a quietness that Miss Marple found, in some obscure way, the most difficult thing of the whole long ordeal to watch. Not because Miss Tanner wept, or protested, or made any scene whatever, but precisely because she did not. She put on her coat, picked up her bag, and walked to the door with the composed, forward-facing dignity of a woman who has made her accounting with herself and has nothing left to resolve. At the door she paused, and turned, and looked back at the room. At Mrs. Higgins, who was crying quietly into her apron. At Tom, who stood with his cap in his hands and could not meet anyone's eyes. At Captain Bellamy, who stood very straight and looked at the floor. At Eleanor Carmichael, who met the look directly and gave the smallest of nods, the meaning of which Miss Marple could not entirely interpret, though she thought she understood something of it. Then she was gone, and the door closed, and the Stag's Rest was one person lighter, and the fire burned on regardless. By midday, the road was passable, after a fashion. Wilkins appeared, unexpectedly, at 11:30, having walked up from where he'd left the car in a barn half a mile down the lane, and announced with the aggrieved air of a man who considers himself to have performed a considerable service entirely without recognition, that he had got the engine running and the way was mostly clear, and they could leave within the hour if Miss Marple wished. Miss Marple wished. She packed her bag in the same quiet, methodical way she had always packed bags, folding things as they ought to be folded, setting her knitting at the top where she could reach it, checking twice for the spectacles that were, on both occasions, on her face. She left the room as she had found it, except rather tidier, and came downstairs for what she suspected would be the last time. Mrs. Higgins pressed sandwiches upon her with the slightly desperate generosity of a woman who needs to be useful, and Miss Marple accepted them with genuine gratitude and the observation that the mulled wine had been extremely restorative, which was perfectly true and made Mrs. Higgins cry again in a slightly happier way. Mr. Higgins shook her hand, briefly and firmly, and said he hoped she'd come back under better circumstances some day, though he said it in the tone of a man who privately expected the Stag's Rest would never again see circumstances that were not, in some degree, worse. Tom brought her bag to the car with the careful, over-serious air of a boy who has learned a great deal in 3 days and is not yet sure what to do with any of it. Miss Marple thanked him and looked at him for a moment with the particular attention she had turned on a great many young people over the years, young people at uncertain crossings who did not yet know which way they would go, and found, on the whole, that she thought well of what she saw. "Don't let it make you hard," she said, which was not what she had intended to say but seemed, when it came out, to be the right thing. Tom looked at her with a bafflement that shaded, around the edges, into something more open than that, and nodded once, slowly, as though he would have to think about it for some time before he fully understood it, but was willing to undertake the thinking. Captain Bellamy she found in the smoking room, standing at the window, watching the white and altered world outside, with the expression of a man examining something he had known for a long time, but seeing it clearly for the first time. He turned when she entered, and looked at her without speaking for a moment. "I owe you an apology," he said at last, "for what I implied, 2 mornings ago, about Miss Tanner." "You implied precisely what any reasonable person might have implied," Miss Marple said, "and I went considerably further down that road than you did, and was rather more wrong, so I am perhaps not the most suitable recipient for the apology." Something very nearly like a smile crossed his face. "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Marple." "I am a very ordinary woman," she said pleasantly, "who has lived a long time in a small village and paid attention. It sounds modest, and I mean it to, because it is the truth." She paused at the door. "I do hope, Captain, that with Mr. Carmichael gone, you may find something like peace. You are owed some, I think, after 20 years without it." He said nothing, but turned back to the window, and she thought, as she left him, that it was not the worst way to leave a man. Eleanor Carmichael she did not see, which was, perhaps, just as well. The door to the small parlour was closed, and Miss Marple passed it quietly, and thought of the woman behind it, the furs, the thin wrists, the 2 small words spoken to the fire, and hoped, in the honest and modest way she had long ago settled upon for hoping, that the world might, in time, offer Eleanor Carmichael something better than the 11 years already behind her. People, in Miss Marple's long experience, very rarely got what they deserved, in either direction, and the only sensible course was to go on with things and be grateful for the exceptions. The car moved slowly down the lane, Wilkins at the wheel with the grimly focused air of a man negotiating a battlefield, and Miss Marple sat in the back with her hands around Mrs. Higgins's sandwiches and her knitting in her lap, watching the Stag's Rest shrink in the rear window until the lane turned and the trees closed in and the inn was gone. The moor opened out on either side, white and immense and empty, the sky above it low and grey, and beginning, very tentatively, to consider the possibility of being something other than a vehicle for snow. A single crow sat on a gatepost as they passed, observing the car with the impartial interest of something that has seen a great many human affairs come and go and expects to see a great many more. Miss Marple looked at it and then looked away, out across the long white emptiness of the dale. She thought of Lucy Tanner. She thought of the word premeditated, and all the cold, legal weight it would carry from here forward, and all the human warmth it did not, quite, account for. She thought of Reginald Carmichael, whom she could not bring herself to mourn, and felt the small, uncomfortable guilt of that, because she had been brought up to believe that every life deserved mourning, and she believed it still, and yet found herself, when she tried, unable to locate any grief she was willing to call genuine. She thought that it was a very complicated world, and that she had known this for a very long time, and that knowing it did not, on the whole, make it any simpler. She picked up her knitting. By the time Helmsley appeared on the horizon, pale and smoke-threaded against the winter sky, 2 inches of a new row were done, small and even and quietly satisfying, and Miss Jane Marple, who had come to Yorkshire for a brief rest and had found rather more than she had bargained for, was already, in the calm and private reaches of her mind, beginning to put it away. Not to forget. She never forgot. Only to set it in its proper place, alongside all the other difficult, necessary, human things she carried, and to go on.